Hey, what's up? Today, I'm gonna show you guys a unique and exciting variation on apple pie that's different in terms of texture and form factor, but it's still distinctly apple pie. And when you put it all together, it actually solves a problem with the original apple pie that I didn't even realize existed. To get started, I'll need some butter. I'm using Kerrygold for this because it has about 3% more fat than regular butter, and when it comes to pastry doughs, higher fat means less potential gluten and a more tender, flakier result. Now to prep this for the pie, I'll grate it on the largest hole sides of my box grater. I should mention that this butter is frozen solid because it's not only much easier to grate this way, but very cold butter will resist unifying with the flour in the dough when we mix it, and that matters a lot. I'll explain why in just a second. Once I've got this butter grated down, I'll grab my food processor and mix 400 grams of all-purpose flour, 40 grams of sugar, 6 grams of salt, and then all of my grated frozen butter. From here, the lid goes on and I'll pulse this 4 to 5 times until the grated butter and flour have just barely come together into a coarse, gravelly texture like this. Now to finish the dough, I'll take a full cup of ice water and measure out 130 grams of just the water part. To keep that chopped up butter pebbly and separated from the flour, we need to hydrate the flour with water that is just as cold. This water's pretty frigid, about 40 F. Now I'll add in half the water with the chopper off, give it a pulse, then the rest of the water goes in and I'll pulse 3 to 4 more times for about 10 seconds in total until the mixture is pebbly and the water is evenly spread throughout. At this point, the dough shouldn't be fused together yet, but it should be hydrated enough to hold itself together when you squeeze it. If your dough is drier than this, go ahead and add just a little bit more water, but too much water is bad. It forms gluten and it makes a bready, chewy pastry, so be careful. The last step here is to flip this pie crust into the bowl that we had the butter in and then squeeze it all together. I basically just want to push everything into a clod without kneading it. And there we go, a combined but still separate mix of flour and butter. See those little droplets? Those are what's going to create steam during the bake, leading to flakiness. Next, I'll move this clod onto a long sheet of plastic wrap and then fold the top and bottom in a way that leaves me 3 inches on each side. We're looking to leave some room for this dough to expand. I'll close in the sides, also leaving some space. Then I'll flip this dough over onto the folded plastic and then gently but firmly pound the dough to flatten it out. Since this pie is going to end up being a large rectangle, it really helps to start the rolling process with a dough that is also shaped like a rectangle. If you started with a tall, round clod like we just had, you'd have to work this dough a lot to get it rolled out. That would develop gluten, making the dough chewy, and it would also smear the butter into the flour, making it much less flaky. Okay, once my dough is flattened into a rustic rectangle like this, I'll move it over to the fridge to relax the gluten, refirm up the butter, and slowly hydrate the flour for about 1 hour. While that rests, let's make the apple part of this pie. For that, I'll need some apples. For this pie, I'm stepping out of my Honeycrisp comfort zone and using an apple that I wrote off a long time ago. The Granny Smith. By themselves, Granny Smiths are way too sour, almost unpleasantly so, but this pie is the perfect fit for that natural acidity. Today, we're using a streusel topping for this pie, and that's quite a bit sweeter than a regular pie crust topping. As a result, we actually need the powerful acidity from the Grannies to help keep all that sugar in balance. Now, I'll just give 8 of these apples a quick peel, then I'll cut them down into a rustic medium-large dice. And once I've got about 1,200 grams of these Granny Smiths chopped down, I'll add in 125 grams of brown sugar, 6 grams of cinnamon, 5 grams of salt, 50 grams of cornstarch. This turns the apple drippings into a goo that binds all the layers of the pie together really beautifully. Next, in goes 15 grams of lemon juice, then lastly, just a little bit of nutmeg. I'm grating some fresh on my microplane here, but of course, pre-ground nutter would also work. Just keep in mind that a little bit goes a very long way here. And once everything's in the bowl, I'll just come back and toss these apples until everything is evenly coated. Next, I'll set these dressed apples aside, grab another empty bowl, then grab some butter that I melted on the back of the stove. Into that bowl, I'll combine 375 grams of all-purpose flour, 225 grams of brown sugar, 6 grams of cinnamon, 5 grams of salt, and then something kind of fun. 75 grams of finely chopped pecans. Conveniently, you can buy these nuts already chopped down at the store. They're called pecan chips, and they bring a little bit of extra texture to the streusel, along with that buttery, foresty pecan flavor that I really love. Into the bowl they go, then I'll add in 230 grams or 2 sticks of melted butter. butter. To mix this, I'll grab a fork and fold everything together. This keeps the mixture off my hands initially while it's still very sticky, but once it's pebbly and hydrated, I do need to come back with my hands and fluff this crumble until it's broken down into pebbles that are about the size of a pea. I don't want huge clods here. Those are going to be dry and powdery and take away from the other textures inside the pie. Now, once I've got dressed apples and a streusel topping, I'll scoot those bowls aside, then grab my rested crust from the fridge. At this point, it's just a touch too firm to roll out without excessive cracking, so I'll set a 15-minute timer and thank Seed for sponsoring this video. We all know that apples are delicious, but did you know that they're also a great source of dietary fiber? Now, eating apples raw, of course, is probably the best way to get that fiber to support your digestive health, but another way I support my gut health is taking 2 of Seed's DS-01 daily symbiotics every single morning. And thanks to DS-01's 24 broad spectrum strains, its benefits go way beyond your gut health. It helps support your skin and your heart health as well. I started taking Seed about 2 years ago based on my own research before they started sponsoring the channel, and I genuinely do endorse this product, not just because of the clinical scientific data that backs it, but because they do extensive third-party testing through each step of the manufacturing process and on the final product as well, which I really appreciate. Right now, Seed is offering you guys 25% off to give DS-01 a try. Just click the link in my description below and use code Brian at checkout. Thank you to Seed for sponsoring this video and for continuing to support my colon's health. 15 minutes later, my dough is slightly softened, so I'll flip it out onto a very well-floured surface. Then I'll turn my cutting board into its vertical config so that I can roll this out into a nice large rectangle. The top side will also get a generous dose of flour. Then I'll grab my rolling pin and roll this out. Just like for croissant or Danish dough, with pie crust, if you use too much pressure in a certain part of the dough, you risk smearing flecks of butter into the flour. That will wreck flakiness, of course, but it'll also make the dough tough. So we want to roll this very slowly and deliberately. Once I've gotten things a little bit flatter here, I'll actually start to roll out the corners to maintain this rectangular shape. Also, to get some additional spreadage here, I sometimes like to pound the dough with the side of my rolling pin. I find that that widens things evenly without putting too much pressure in any one place. From here, I'll continue to roll this out while flipping and flouring the dough 2 or 3 times. As the dough gets thinner, it also gets wetter and will want to stick to the board. And once I've got this dough stretched out into an even sheet that's about 15 by 20 inches, I'll grab my half sheet tray to size things up. As you can see, it's about 1 to 2 inches wider all the way around, and that's what I'm looking for. So next, I'll clean up the sides real quick by cutting them into straight lines. I find this helps get the crust more evenly spread out in the pan and overall just makes it look prettier. And there we go, a sheet tray sized pie crust. Next, I'll make sure things are very, very well floured. Then I'll roll this crust up onto my rolling pin, then carefully unroll it onto a well-buttered half sheet tray. From there, I'll carefully scoot things around to make sure it's filling the corners and is evenly laid out in the pan. Then I'll come back and carefully fold the overhanging dough backwards over itself. This is going to help keep the crust from slumping into the pan. Once I'm rolled over here, I'll do one last move and give this a little finger crimp to make the crust look pretty. This part is totally optional, but I think it adds a little bit of something to the overall aesthetic. And that is a huge frickin' pie crust. It looks great, except for that one corner. Don't look at that. Now, the last step before filling this is to give the center a quick dock with a fork. This will help keep the crust from bubbling up and steaming underneath during the bake. Next, I'll drop in all of my apples with their drippings. From there, I'll spread those out evenly from crust to crust, making sure to fill any gaps. 1,200 grams of apples should be more than enough to cover this tightly. Behind the apples, I'll add on my streusel. As I drop this, I'm making sure to get it mixed into any voids left behind the apples, and I'm crumbling down any huge clots. Again, if the crumbles are too large, they're going to make this pie too crunchy. Yes, that is possible. And once this pie is evenly coated with the streusel topping, it's time to bake. So I'll move this over to a preheated 375F oven and bake it for 45 to 50 minutes on top of a pizza steel or stone. The underheat of that steel is gonna greatly improve the cooking of the bottom of this pie and get some really even browning. You can definitely make it without it, but you might wanna bake your pie for about 10 minutes longer. And after about a 48-minute bake, you can see we've got a burnished brown on this crust, so it's time to pull it out. From here, I'll let it cool for about 10 minutes before I cut into it. Woo! You guys, The flatter variation of apple pie is just so much more intense than its trad, round, double-crusted cousin. It exists as a perfect case study in textural balance. There's a nearly even ratio of flaky, buttery crust, tender, gooey apples, and crunchy, cinnamon-flavored streusel. In fact, this version of apple pie made me realize that regular apple pie is deeply flawed. It's got too many apples. Think about it. Cooked apples aren't that fun to eat by themselves, and when you're eating apple pie, you're always hunting for the crust to make the bite work. This pie makes me feel unsafe. Like if you left me alone with it, I'm gonna do something that I will regret. That is freaking insane. I'm not just saying that. This is not like acting. That is, I gotta rethink some shit after that. Anyways, I really hope you guys try this recipe sometime soon. Beware, it's very dope. And if you want more sheet tray cookery, check out this video for a giant crispy sheet pan pizza. I'll see you there. Let's eat this thing.